Well, hello everybody. We are in for another exciting chapter. This is chapter 4, which is tissues. And this is an interesting chapter because lots of what you do on your lab will involve a lot of what we're talking about. So I'm going to focus on a couple of things here. We're going to focus on epithelial cells. We're going to focus on connective tissue. And we're also going to focus on muscles. All right, so let's just get right on to it. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about is the type of cell that probably does, I want to say, the most general functions. Well, maybe general is not really the right way to put it, but this just does a lot of functions that are essential for the proper, function of the organism. These cells do a lot of things to aid in life. And let's go ahead and talk about some of them. So these cells are called epithelial cells. Epithelial for covering. And these are cells, well, you spend most of your time looking at dead epithelial cells. When we get to the integument system, you'll see exactly what I mean. But epithelial cells, I guess you can say, if we're going to have just a standard definition, these are cells that line the outside of organs and the inside of openings. That's generally a pretty, I guess you can say, that is a good rule of thumb for them, is that they're going to be on the outside of organs for the most part, and also the inside of them. So basically, what their job is that their job is to be wherever there is going to be some kind of friction or something needs to be absorbed or secreted. And I know it seems weird that I can't really tell you exactly a hard line, okay, epithelial cells are found here. It's sort of specific toward the organ. We'll be getting into lots of examples of epithelial cells. But basically, most of them look like this. They come in different shapes, but it's going to be a cell that is going to be covered with hair-like things called microvilli. These are tiny hairs that increase surface area. As we talked about last chapter, a surface area is how much space is on the outside of something that allows for things to move through it. Well, microvilli, they're like tiny ridges that increase surface area. Because, of course, this is going to have more space than this, right? I think we can agree on that. So anyways, what these cells are is that they're going to be anchored to the cell next to them. And I'll get into these specifics in a second. I just want to give you a rough idea. So these are going to be an example of an epithelial cell called a simple columnar cell. I'll just write that here. It doesn't really matter. We're just doing this as an example. So this is a simple columnar cell, epithelial cell. Now, simple just means one layer. Something tells me I don't need to humor you and tell you what columnar means. Columnar. What does this look like? The name is true to form. So these cells are going to be continuous. You aren't going to find epithelial cells by themselves. They're going to be in some kind of tissue. Now, what's interesting about these is that they actually have no direct blood supply. Instead, the blood supply sits alone. These are called avascular. There's also two types of bound or barriers or attachments, I guess you could say. One is called basal lamina. Basal lamina. And the other is going to be called reticular layer. And these are two layers that aim to attach the epithelial cells, almost like glue them to connective tissue. So I'm going to say that this is going to be connective tissue. And then we have our two layers, the basal lamina, which I just drew here, and the reticular layer. And nutrients are going to diffuse from the blood into the epithelial cells because there's no direct blood supply. Things like oxygen are going to diffuse in here. Carbon dioxide is going to diffuse out. So this is just an example of how the epithelial cells look. These are simple. To give you some examples of where epithelial cells are found, is they're found in the lining of the digestive system. They make up the dermis and epidermis. Now, the epithelial cells you see on your skin right now, those are very dead because they start out alive. The very first layer of the epidermis is actually alive. It's a cell that's constantly dividing. But as it gets pushed up to the surface, it dies and is filled with a bunch of protein to make it tough. Also, it's found on the inside of cheeks. So the cells, the epithelial cells that make up your the inside of your cheeks, they are layered and they're also very much alive, which is why, well, if you cut your cheek with something, it's going to hurt because it's very much alive. And it makes up the tubes of the kidney. So we're just going to call this the renal tubules. Those are the functional units of the kidneys, the part that's responsible for filtering. And that is largely going to be where they are found. Just some examples, but they're found in many areas. Okay, right on. So now we're going to get into some characteristics. And I'm just going to go ahead to make this simple. I'm going to redraw this. Now you're probably saying, well, why is it that we have skin? What's the purpose of it? And the answer is protection. So one job of epithelial cells, so I'm just going to draw some cells that just some example cells. So this is going to be some epithelial cells. We'll just go ahead and say that, yeah, random epithelial cells. And underneath, of course, is going to be our basal lamina. This is going to be the reticular layer. And recall that this serves to anchor the epithelial cells to the tough connective tissue. And then we're going to have the blood supply. I think we can agree here that the inside of the body is very delicate and very important. And you have things in there like internal organs that keep us alive. You want to keep those protected. Not only that, but we have things like blood in our body that are highly nutritious, and bacteria would love to just hitch a ride in our blood supply and go and start to grow and, well, colonize inside of us, which they already pretty much have with the digestive system, but you get my point. So one job of epithelial tissues is protection. To give you some example of that, the epidermis provides a watertight and airtight barrier between the outside environment and the inside of our body, because these cells here are very tough. To give you another example, they also can be in areas where they are very layered, and they can resist friction. For example, the inside of your mouth and in your cheeks. You're constantly eating food that may not exactly be very friendly to the mouth. You might scrape your cheek, it might be a bit damaged, but at the same time, it's going to protect the inside of your body from the effects of whatever you ate that scraped you. And think about it like this here. Bacteria are everywhere. You are a bacteria swimming pool. And I'm not saying that to be personal. I'm a bacteria swimming pool. Everything's a bacteria swimming pool. And that's because bacteria doubles every 20 to 25 minutes under pretty normal conditions. So because of that, if bacteria get into your body and they divide every 20 to 25 minutes, you can have a nasty, rip-roaring infection in no time flat. Now, if the outside environment is filled with bacteria and the inside environment doesn't need bacteria or doesn't want bacteria, or else we'll be in big trouble, what is the only thing that can serve as a proper protective mechanism against the outside environment? And that is the epithelial cells that make up the epidermis. Don't want to ruin the surprise because next chapter we'll be talking about it more. But these cells are multi-layered, very tough, and they protect us from all of the environmental damaging things that can cause us severe illness or injury. Because despite us being covered with bacteria, unless you're currently fighting an infection, you are sterile inside of your body. There is not a single pathogenic bacteria that is colonizing your body right now, thanks to the amazing protective qualities of the epithelial tissue, in concordance with your own immune system. So this is protection against abrasions and chemicals. Next is going to be absorption. To absorb is to bring from the apical surface to the basolateral surface, usually into the blood. So once again, absorption. Absorption is through the apical surface, and it goes transcellular through the basolateral surface into the blood. Now you're probably saying, well, what are some situations where that happens? One example we can use is digestion. So I'm going to draw here a simple columnar cell that lines the inside lumen is opening, of the intestines. They look like, well, they look quite a bit different than this, but I'm not going to complicate it. And once your food is digested, it's in the lumen. I'm just going to do this as nutrients. Because, of course, the purpose of digestion, we're trying to take those complex polymers that we talked about, carbohydrates, proteins, DNA. We're trying to break it down into monomers, like glucose, amino acids, nucleic acids. And then once we break that down, we want to absorb them into our blood. We absorb them through the columnar epithelial cells. They travel through the transcellular pathway, through the apical side, which is the part that faces the opening, through the basolateral side. I'll just write basal here. It's going to go straight into your blood. When you absorb something, you're basically moving it toward your blood supply, more or less. That's kind of a good rule of thumb. Now also, it has the job of filtration. So one thing I didn't tell you about this basement membrane, let me take away this arrow. One thing I didn't tell you about this basement membrane is that it actually acts to filter certain molecules, filtration. So let's say that something is going to be filtered from the epithelium to the blood. Well, that basement membrane here, which recall is the is the basal lamina and the reticular layer. They not only act to anchor, but they also act to filter certain molecules. So these act to filter certain molecules. Right on. And these are things that you really do not want to pass into the blood. It is a filtering system for things that could possibly harm the body. Next is going to be a process called excretion. And this has to do with the renal system. So what's interesting about the epithelium is that they line the outside of certain organs and the inside. So one of the interesting things about the epithelial tissue is that there's a lot of variety of them. And there is one type of epithelial tissue that you'll learn about called transitional epithelial tissue. And this is interesting because if you are to look at it under a microscope, the cells are kind of going to look like this. You're going to see some that kind of look normal, and then some that kind of look stretched. Maybe some that even look more stretched. Okay, that's a big epithelial cell. Whoa. And the reason why is because it is a state of transition. Is transitional epithelial cells can also expand when needed. So this is a perfect example of the bladder. We know that the bladder can expand when filled with urine. What causes it to expand? Well, this layer of transitional epithelial tissue that has the unique qualities of being able to expand when needed. And that's how epithelial cells support the process of excretion, which is to eliminate from the body. Next is secretion. And if you recall what secretion is it moves from the basolateral side to the apical side. And one example of that is going to be the process of glands. So there's two types of glands. We're not going to get in too much of that, but one are glands that secrete substances into lumen or surface of body. So one example of that's going to be a sweat gland, or goblet cells that secrete mucus. So those are examples of glandular secretions. Something else is going to be called an endocrine gland. And these cells are interesting because they actually do not have ducts. In fact, before they were called endocrine cells, we called them the ductless glandular system. So endocrine glands, they secrete chemicals and hormones into the blood. In fact, you probably have heard about the endocrine hormones. Those are secreted by endocrine cells. These are things that are made inside the cell and stored, but they are not secreted through glands, like sweat glands, for example. They're secreted into the blood via exocytosis. And next is going to be sensory reception. So what's interesting is that these cells may be avascular, but they are innervated. And you're probably saying, what does that mean? So if we're going to see an epithelial cell here, it's also going to be intertwined with nerve tissue. So I'm going to draw kind of the layer of the epithelial of the integument. So this is what the cells look of the epidermis. As I said, it's multi-layered. I'm not going to draw too much detail here. Then you have the dermal layer. And inside the dermal layer, you're going to have neurons. Neurons that detect sensory stimuli, like thermal receptors. You don't need to know the names of these now. Cells that detect touch and pressure. Cells that detect pain. So these are cells that are intertwined with sensory receptors. And sensory receptors, what they do is that they take information from the external environment and feed it into the brain. So they may be avascular, they don't have their own blood supply, but they are innervated with sensory neurons. All right, so those are the sort of an introduction to the purposes of these. And now we're going to repeat some of this, but also go into some new stuff here with characteristics. So now we're going to be talking about characteristics. All right, and the first is polarity. There are two separate sides of the epithelial cell. So once again, this is the surface, and the surface is not smooth, as I told you. It has these tiny ridges called microvilli. You will notice that when you, I'm pretty sure it's going to have this, when you look at visual body, you'll see that one of the epithelial cells has hairs on it, or what looks like hairs. We call that cilia. Cilia are like, it's going to sound disgusting, little worms that sway back and forth. Microvilli, they look more, you can't really see them on a light microscope, but they kind of look fuzzy under a very powerful microscope. So anyways, we have some polarity here. We have differences. The apical side. So the apical side, this opens to surface or lumen. Recall that the lumen is the inside of an organ. So for example, the lumen of the stomach, the lumen of the intestines. And the basolateral side is more toward the blood. So basolateral, think of basal for basement, basolateral, close to connective tissue. That's probably a safer thing to say than blood, because the connective tissue is closer. So there are two aspects of it, apical and basolateral. And as I said, the basolateral has the two layers. We have the basal lamina as well as the reticular layer. Next is going to be continuity. Oh, so let me put this to the side so it's more organized. So we have, so we have polarity, right on. Now we're going to have continuity. So as we talked about in previous chapters, am I spelling continuity right? Probably not. As we talked about in previous chapters is the epithelial cells, they're not by themselves. Actually, I just said that this chapter, never mind. but they are connected with something called tight junctions or desmosomes, which are like rivets. What this does is it makes these continuous. And I think that's something that students that first take A and P courses, what they're a bit confused about is, in your bio textbooks for general bio, a cell just looks like a round thing with a bunch of stuff in it, when really there is not a cell in the human body that looks like that. It is literally a teaching tool. Cells mainly make up tissues, which are a bunch of cells stapled together. So that's that. So they are continuous. And if you want to see which cells are the individual cells, you have to look for the nuclei, because each cell has a nuclei. It just may not be in the center like your bio textbooks lead you to believe. All right. As I talked about ad nauseum before, is that there's two layers that make up what's called the basement membrane. Let's go ahead and talk about our basement membrane. So the basolateral side of the epithelial cell is always going to connect to the basement membrane. And if you remember, what this does is it reinforces. So it helps to connect the epithelial cells to the connective tissue. And it also filters. So it filters certain things from going into the cell or into the blood. Also, what we talked about is that it is avascular. Avascular means it does not have its own blood supply. So avascular does not have its own blood supply. Instead, the blood is going to be underneath the basement membrane and connective tissue. And nutrients are going to diffuse through. So as you can probably imagine, this is not a very metabolically active tissue, not nearly as much as muscles. All right, and next, probably the best properties of these is regeneration. So there are a group of cells that we call stem cells. And stem cells have an ability to differentiate into many other cells. Stem cell therapy is rapidly growing in our society. I know there's a lot of ethical issues because some stem cells need to be taken during the embryonic stage of development. And I think you can understand why there's a lot of moral issues that need to be worked out with that. But there are stem cells all throughout our bodies. You probably learned about a process in bio called mitosis. Really, the only cells in the body that undergo mitosis are stem cells. Muscle cells rarely undergo mitosis. Bone cells rarely undergo mitosis. But epithelial cells, they may not be able to undergo mitosis, but usually there's a layer of actively dividing stem cells beneath them. For example, the very first layer of the epidermis is made up of stem cells that keep on dividing and keep on turning into, or differentiating into skin cells, more or less. Which is why if something happens and that layer is destroyed, you will no longer be able to regenerate skin cells like you were in the past. That's what happens when you have a scar on occasion. All right, so what happens is that these cells get damaged all the time. And what's going to happen is that eventually they are going to break off. And the layer beneath them is going to, once again, divide. So this is what it actually looks like. So you have the layer of stem cells beneath. As these stem cells double, they're going to push the old layer on top, and the new layer on bottom is going to keep on dividing. And you're going to keep on having a constantly dividing layer. What's interesting is that the columnar cells in the digestive system, in the intestines, they actually regenerate about once every 7 days. It doesn't matter if these cells are damaged or not. Every 7 days, it's like a timer where they where they undergo what's called apoptosis, which is programmed cell death, and a new cell develops via mitosis and takes its place. And of course, you're probably saying, well, what's the advantage of that? Well, epithelial cells especially get old. They're designed to be replaced. And if they get old and they're less efficient, that means you aren't going to be absorbing as much nutrients from your food. Therefore, it's very important that they always act in peak condition. All right, so that is our section on the epithelial cells. And you'll be learning a lot more about these, of course, during your lab. All right, next we have connective tissue. See you soon. Okay, everyone, well, welcome back. We're now going to be talking about connective tissue. And connective tissue is actually the most abundant type of tissue because there are things that are connective tissue that you would never guess are connective tissue. Let's go ahead and get started on this. So we have connective tissue. And we're going to start by talking about some types. Now, as I said, is that you'll be learning the different types during your visual body lab. I'm sure that is going to cover that ad nauseum. So it is consisting mainly of something called ground substance, which I'll talk about in a moment. Now, the first purpose of connective tissue is that it binds and supports. And you're probably saying, well, what does it bind? So we have this thing called a skeleton, in case you haven't been keeping touch with things, but it is indeed the supportive structure of our body. And we have a bunch of stuff attached to it. If we didn't have supportive structures keeping us anchored to the skeleton, then we would not be able to function. And if you think about it, if you want things to stick together and you want it to be fairly flexible, what would you use? You would use something that is strong, yet a little bit malleable. Most types of connective tissue actually do have some flexibility. For example, cartilage. Others are very inflexible and are not designed to move at all. And most of those are ligaments. So anyways, I'll give you some examples of things that bind and support, and we're going to have ligaments. And ligaments, what they do, we'll talk about these later, but they actually connect bone to bone. To give you an example is we have basically three structures that are really not designed to connect to each other. And it's the femur, and then the fibula and tibia. And these bones really are not designed to connect to each other at all. And I guess one way that evolution solved this is just to, well, use a bunch of bands. So you have something in between the knee. We have something called a meniscus. It's like a pad that connects both of these structures together. And meniscus is made up of certain tissue that also can have some characteristics of connective tissue. You also have ligaments, the medial collateral ligament that stops the bones from caving inward, the lateral collateral ligament, which stops them from going outward. Then you have the anterior and posterior cruciate ligaments. What these do is that they prevent the two bones from sliding forward or backward. These are not designed to be flexible. What's interesting is that they can resist incredible forces as far as moving vertically, like this, because the fibers are arranged in one direction. So as long as you don't do any motion that's a twisting motion or a shearing motion, then it's going to last you the entirety of your life probably without ever having a problem. Problem is that since the fibers are arranged vertically, what happens is that if you play sports and you plant your leg and then you either turn the wrong way or somebody um, hits you at the point of the knee, it's going to cave in and break. Or if you twist, it's going to do shearing forces and break. If any one of you has ever had an anterior cruciate ligament injury or a lateral or medial collateral ligament injury, you'll feel that your leg feels very unstable. That's because you've lost one of the ligaments that supports the two bones being together to form um, a functional knee joint. So ligaments connect bone to bone. Another example is going to be tendons. And tendons are weird. It's basically a bridge between muscle and bone. So tendons connect muscle to bone. And you probably hear of one tendon in particular being torn, especially if you watch sports, the Achilles tendon. And if you, unfortunately, we will not be able to see this on cadaver models, but you'll see it's a huge tendon that anchors to the heel. Now, the issue with tendons being torn is that, as I said, tendons are basically an extension of muscle and bone. So it actually starts off as muscle, then as the muscle gets closer and closer to the bone, it gradually transitions to connective tissue and then the bone. So what do you do if you tear it? Well, you basically have to stitch it back together, but it's not going to be as taut. It's not going to have the same properties that allow it to function normally. So tendons also bind muscle to bone. And they also support structures to function properly. Okay, now the next purpose is going to be protection. And the skeleton is a great example of something that protects. So let me get this out of the way here. And now we have protection. Now an example of protection is going to be the skeleton. Skeleton is designed to be light, but also very durable. And the skeleton is able to protect the internal organs, especially ones behind the thoracic cage, also known as the rib cage. It is a strong structure that can resist several physical forces. It might break, but the good thing about the skeleton is that it can always repair. You also have adipose. So adipose tissue actually cushions and protects internal organs from being physically damaged. Next is going to be insulation. Now you probably are going to guess if I tell you which type of connective tissue is responsible for insulation. That'll be adipose. So adipose tissue actually has many purposes in the body. It is a very important tissue. Society has demonized it as, oh, fat is bad. No, fat is actually very good because it does protect against physical trauma as well as insulating heat to keep you warm. Not to typecast, but most people who are very thin get cold faster than those that are rather robust. And it's because it is a correlation between adipose tissue and feelings of warmth. Not always, but sometimes. Next is going to be storage. And storage, this might actually surprise you a bit. Storage is not only adipose tissue, which stores energy, but also bone. Bones store calcium, which is a very important signaling molecule. We'll learn that the bone is basically a calcium savings account that the body borrows from when it needs more blood calcium. Blood calcium is just that important. And last one is going to be transportation. Now you're probably saying, transportation, what kind of connective tissue transports? The answer to that is blood. Blood is considered a connective tissue. And that's because blood has a compound in it called fibrinogen, which does nothing until it converts to fibrin. These are actually strands of protein that act as clotting mechanisms. Because when you have clotting mechanisms, what happens is that you can repair trauma, you can repair damage. So fibrin makes blood a connective tissue. Blood transports nutrients all throughout the body. All of our cells need some kind of blood supply. All right, now common characteristics. All right, everyone, so now we're on to common characteristics. These are things that connective tissue has in common. And the first one is going to be very important. It's going to be an extracellular matrix. Extracellular matrix begins with cells that secrete ground substance, and these end with blast. So a site is a cell. These are supportive structures, which we'll talk about later. But blasts, like for example, osteoblasts, they secrete active ground substance, which is a gelatinous structure. So these are going to be the blasts. What they are going to do is they are going to secrete ground substance. And it's a network of fibers, as you'll see during the lab. It's a network of fibers, and it forms kind of a network. The reason why is that this needs to be permeable to water, because if water and nutrients are going to go from the blood to the cell, because recall that epithelial cells are connected to ground substance, it needs to be able to diffuse through these, I guess you can call them cracks here, to get to the cell. This extracellular matrix is usually non-living, because the ground substance secreted is a number of compounds that are usually composed of inorganic molecules. You see here, I'm drawing some green things here. These are osteocytes, and they support the structure once the osteoblasts have secreted enough substance. What am I doing? Osteocytes. So anything that ends with cyte means cell. They also have common origins. And you don't need to know too much about this, but it is going to be called mesenchyme. This is what we are born with. It's sort of like a foundation, and it can differentiate into many types of connective tissue. Okay, so what exactly is this ground substance made up of? So ground substance, what exactly is it made up of? Well, the first is going to be interstitial fluid. Interstitial is another term for extracellular fluid. Most connective tissue is largely especially the looser connective tissue that's a little bit more malleable, it's going to be composed mainly of water. So this is kind of what connective tissue of ground substance looks like. These are the sites, and these are going to be the networks, the fibers that make up the network. It contains mostly water, which I'll show here in blue. I'm not going to go to town on this because I'm pretty sure you get the idea. So interstitial fluid makes up a large portion of looser connective tissue, especially because this ground substance must be permeable to water so we can get to the cells. Next, they're called cell adhesion proteins. I'll draw it over here. Cell adhesion proteins, and these do exactly what their name says. They are adhesives that keep cells connected to the ground substance. So these things anchor cells to the ground substance. And lastly, we have these things, these very strong supportive structures called proteoglycans. What this is that these are a network of proteins that actually look like this. There's a protein core, and then there are extensions made up mainly of sugars. Wait, why are we using the same color? They're made up mainly of sugars that kind of extend like a brush. And these are supportive structures that help to maintain the integrity of the ground substance. All right, next is going to be muscle tissue. Now, I'm not going too much in depth in this chapter because most of what you need to know is going to be for the lab practical. This is just an introduction to what the various tissues are, their characteristics. Muscle tissue, we have 3 different types. We have smooth muscle tissue, which is involuntary and is found in structures such as the liver, the stomach, intestinal tissue, but very valid, we'll be talking about this a lot, actually is a large component of your blood vessels. And they're able to either open your blood vessels so they can let more blood through, or they can slightly constrict them to raise your blood pressure or let less blood through. But that's another story for a different day. So anyways, muscle kind of looks like this. And we have the tendon that's going to extend to a muscle fiber. Well, actually, this is a muscle bundle. And inside this muscle bundle is going to be things called fascicles. So next time you look at a steak, just note that it's actually made up of these structures called fascicles, and that's found all throughout the tissue. And they are filled with these things called myocytes, which are cells. They are muscle cells. I'm going to draw you a muscle cell that kind of looks like this. And like any other cell that has a nucleus, which I'll draw here in pink, in fact, it has several nuclei. And it also has these organelles, which you should have learned about, or you've seen in various memes, called mitochondria that give energy. In fact, these myocytes are loaded with mitochondria because they must constantly have energy to do their jobs, which is contract. And these are actually made up of filaments called myosin and actin. We'll be talking about these later on, so don't get too concerned about writing this down. And they alternate. This is what gives muscle its striated appearance. So myofilaments, they have a job. So we'll say that we're going to zoom in on a myofilament. This is it relaxed. And this is what it looks like contracted. So basically what happens is that muscle works through a series of contractions, just getting smaller, more or less. The purpose of muscle is to move bones, and that's what they do. Well, that's skeletal muscle, but smooth muscle has many purposes. Cardiac muscle is designed to contract a lot. So types of voluntary muscle. In fact, there's only one type of voluntary muscle. That is going to be skeletal muscle. These are the only muscles that we have conscious control over. Researchers still are not sure why we can consciously control our muscles. Why can we think and then do? Why is it that you are able to write notes because you want to? We're not exactly sure how that happens. Of course, we have lots of theories that are probably pretty much spot on, but there's no like, okay, this is why. We've isolated the part of the brain, but we still don't understand it. Involuntary muscle is cardiac and smooth. And cardiac muscle, we know what the purpose of that is. It's responsible for the heart contracting. Smooth muscle, though, has a variety of functions, as I said. It involves things like sphincters that either open or close. We have things like smooth muscle in the intestines, which is responsible for moving and constricting. Kind of hard to describe the function of the stomach and the intestinal tract. They squeeze, they twist, they squeeze more. Okay, the next is going to be nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is extremely diverse, to put it nicely. Let me show you all a picture. I'm going to go ahead and unshare this for a second, just to show you how much nerve tissue is in our body. And by the way, nerve tissue is another term for nerve cells. We have about 80 billion neurons, I think it is. So I'm going to look up this body world nervous system. Here we go. Nervous system, man or woman. So this is basically isolated only the neurons in the body. So this is what the average person looks like if you were to strip them down to their neurons. And if you look there, that is an extremely extensive network. And believe it or not, they all basically emanate from the brain or the spinal cord. So you see here the brain connects to the spinal cord, and you see all these extensions jut out. So more or less, almost all these signals, they originate from the brain in some way, which is amazing if you think about it. So what happens is that nervous tissue it allows us to exhibit controlled, conscious, and involuntary control of muscles. So when you want your muscles to contract, it all starts from the brain. The brain sends the signal down the appropriate neurons, and then the neurons synapse or connect at your muscle tissue, and they release signaling molecules that kindly ask your muscles to contract. So really, you don't even have control over your muscles. Your nervous system does, and tells it when it wants it to contract. Of course, if there is any damage to the spinal cord and those neurons are damaged, you lose that voluntary control over certain muscles. The muscles themselves are fine. The network that tells it to move is not fine. So what these do is that one job is that they're going to receive stimuli. Not to go all metaphysical on you guys, but if you focus on your sensations, Focus on the stimuli that is being received by your eyes, that's transmitted to your brain through a network of neurons called photoreceptors. Think about the smells. They are picked up by sensory receptors in your olfactory system. Think about touch. Touch your desk. Feel these sensations. They are activating neurons that are going to your brain and recording that. So we have neurons called sensory neurons that receive stimuli and feed it to your brain. Sometimes you can control those sensations and sometimes you can't. Optical illusions are a good example of that. Is your brain decides that, oh, okay, even though we're seeing this, we really should be seeing that. Also, you can respond to stimuli. And this is going to control muscles in some way. If you are watching this lecture and taking notes, what you're doing is you're seeing me deliver this amazing lesson that I'm sure has you captivated. And if you are not being captivated and you're doing something else like texting, I know. Because if I was watching my own lecture, I'd probably be texting. But anyways, bear with me, we're almost done. Continue to take notes. So it's going to control muscles in some way. If you're walking down, if you're walking on the street and you pass a grizzly bear, you're probably going to, that sensory information is going to be fed to your brain. Your brain is going to cross-check that with everything you know about grizzly bears. Probably going to find out pretty quickly that you are in trouble, and you are probably going to book it. So depending on the stimuli that you receive, you're going to respond in some way. And how this does is it transmits electrical impulses. Transmits electrical impulses. Now, if you think about it, why is it that you're able to think and act so fast? It's because electricity moves extremely fast. And that's how neurons transmit signals. So this is a neuron, for example. And we'll say that this is muscle right over here. What's going to happen here is that stimuli is going to be received at one end of the neuron. This is called the dendrite. So stimuli received. And then we'll talk about this in a later chapter. But in electrical impulse is going to be generated. It's going to move down the neuron. And then it's going to trigger this muscle to move in some way. Okay, well, that is the end of chapter 4. Short, but it did the job. In fact, I think chapter 4 is one of the shortest chapters in the body, at least body course for this course, because as I said, most of it's going to be practical knowledge. I'm going to post a list of all the muscles you need to know, all of the types of tissues you need to know for the upcoming lab practical. All right, everyone, over and out. Thanks for tuning in.